Good afternoon, fans and followers of China Rising Radio Sinoland. Jeff J. Brown reporting from Shenzhen, just south of the Tropic of Cancer. Good afternoon. This is going to be a podcast reading of the article number 2, part 2 of 8 of Ramin Mazaheri's series on the New China Scholarship. If you did not read the first one, go to chinarising.puntopress.com or go to the bottom, go to the description in the YouTube or SoundCloud podcast, and I will put the hyperlink to this article, and it will list the article number 1. This one is, and I would also like to say, for all of everybody listening on SoundCloud, iTunes, and Stitcher, and everybody watching on YouTube, how seriously humbled and honored I am that Ramin chose my writing as a prime example of the New China Scholarship. So it's a real privilege for me to be able to share it with you. He has a great take and has a lot of original thoughts and ideas, and as we go through the rest of the series. Part number 2, daring to go beyond Western propaganda on the Great Leap Forward's famine. There's a picture of some starving children, starving Chinese children lying in a street. Above, Western circulated photo of Chinese famine. Images don't lie, they say, but erasing context does, an old Western technique. As explained by the Wikipedia, rarely an impartial source, the Great Chinese Famine 1959 to 1961, quote, was caused by social pressure, economic mismanagement, and radical changes in agriculture, in addition to weather conditions and natural disasters. Mao Zedong, chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, introduced drastic changes in farming which prohibited farm ownership, end of quote. Can anyone detect hostility towards communism and Mao in this little paragraph? It could have been written by a CIA-influenced asset, and probably was. And then today, now, hunger and starvation are more and more common in the United States and Britain, and is no longer a problem in China. Between 108 BC and 911 AD, there were no fewer than 1,828 recorded famines in China, or nearly one each year. Since 1962, there should have been in China, if their historical average remained unchanged, 50 serious famines. Instead, there have been 0. When one discusses China and famine, how often do you hear this totally valid point of view? I wonder, given 50-plus years of success, how much longer can the West wave this bloody shirt? Will there still be a thriving Great Leap famine intellectual cottage industry in 50 years, 100 years, 200 years? Kudos to you if you are a reasonable person who prefers fairness and honesty to anti-socialist animosity of the knee-jerk variety. But even that one fact doesn't allow us to fully appreciate how difficult it was for the Chinese Communist Party to defeat famine. Blame Mother Nature. Topographically, China is very far from India. Wide open India can allow cows to graze in peace, but mountainous China can only afford to allot just 2% of its land for pasture, compared with 50% for the U.S. Nearly 90% of China's farmland has to go for crops because they have to feed 20% of the world's population, and from just 6% of the world's arable land. Around 85% of the population already lives on the 1/3 of the land which is arable, and there is little chance that they can increase this amount of arable land. The South farms year-round, but in northern China, where China began historically, The topography and climate is akin to the Midwestern United States or Ukraine. However, average annual rainfall is a U.S. Dust Bowl like 25 inches with annual variances of 30%, making the region especially prone to famine. No wonder Chinese farmers back the central planning, cooperation, and easy credit of socialism. Capitalistic individualism could obviously not thrive in such harsh conditions, and thus it never has. And this cultural fact well predates 1949, whether one likes it or not. China's constant famines were, and are we not grateful that we can switch to the past tense now? Despite a 2 millennia-old system of centralized imperialism, so cooperative and well-planned that ancient farmers knew they were growing crops expressly to be shipped to famine-prone regions on the other side of China. Such central planning is what allows unity, China will attest. This view is the polar opposite of today's Germans, who turn their immoral noses up at the idea of showing solidarity with debt-blighted Greeks, who were blighted by German bankers, of course. But China's governments, imperialist and communist, did their best to not permit the anti-harmony societal disorder caused by unrestrained individualism. Indeed, Mao's food procurement policies, taking food from those who grew it and giving it to the less successful farmers, was truly a continuation of age-old cultural policy. It is only the West that derides that policy as a horrible violation of their supreme sanctity, which is, my private property is all mine. And despite all these constraints and historical proofs of guaranteed failures, in 2018, China's malnutrition is lower than in developed countries. China exports food. Accordingly, in 2016, the UN's World Food Program signed a memorandum of understanding intended to help developing countries learn from China's success in fighting hunger. Hunger should be treated in the same way as a natural disaster. Iran's biggest curse is earthquakes, and were it not for vast anti-Islam sentiment, many more would learn about our similarly amazing socialist-inspired techniques for dealing with the aftermaths of earthquakes. The Chinese Communist Party has seemingly done the impossible, ended the scourge of famine in China. Despite all this success, the famine of the Great Leap Forward is perhaps the single most important pillar in the West's anti-China propaganda. It is all the proof one Westerner must cite in order to discredit the Communist Party, Mao, and any of China's successes in any field. This is the second part in an 8-part series which examines the rise of the new internet-available Western scholarship on China. Finally, the average person can easily find analysis of Red China, which focuses on the view from the 99% as a long-awaited counterbalance to the decades of Western scholarship on China, which primarily sought to maintain the 1%'s insistence of the West's total ideological superiority. The only remedy to such absurdities are articles such as this one, but especially books such as China is Communist, Damn It, by Jeff J. Brown. This new kind of scholarship on China is a remedy to the old Western scholarship on China, which is typified by a book called China, A New History by John Fairbank. This Harvard professor-written book is likely the most popular university-level textbook on China in the United States, and Fairbanks is known as the, quote, the West doyen on China. In this series, I toggle back and forth between these two sources, which are clearly on both sides of the spectrum, and the comparison is illuminating. Fairbanks' establishment view is well known, but is it accurate? Of course, the pro-socialist side provides us with a new perspective, but is it based on facts? Judge for yourself in the following comparison, which also adds in my personal views about the matter. The West's false moral causes of the Great Leap's famine. The 1959 to 1961 famine is not close to China's worst famine. Historically, you had three famines which claimed 15, 30, and 45 million people in the 19th century alone. 6 million people died in 1927, and there were major famines in 1929, 1939, and 1942. All of these were caused by environmental factors and, of course, political factors as well. It's not as if China didn't have a government back then. It's just that they didn't have a government which could cope, in undeniable contrast to China over the last 50-plus years. I'm not saying that the deaths of 15 to 20 million people were not important. I'm accurately adding that they were, sadly, not unusual in China whatsoever. Nobody honest would consider this context of near-annual famines irrelevant, but the West focuses like a laser on the Great Leap Forward's famine in an unusually ahistorical vacuum. For the West, the Great Leap's famine was caused by ineffective, overpaid bureaucrats who worked for a totalitarian regime, along with the routine implication that the Communist Party inflicted this famine on purpose in order to settle scores, intimidate the populace, hoard wealth for themselves, are inherently immoral and callous in a way which capitalists could never be, and other such similar nonsense. Another common Western stereotype in scholarship on the Great Famine, and a routine quote, explanation for Fairbanks, is the docility of the Chinese farmer. This docility, it is implied, is the only way they would have allowed the Communist Party to take control. Laugh out loud. And they just plain lack the testosterone which the West has in spades, and which is their aggressive answer to everything. I guess we need to get Chinese peasants some crystal meth to pep them up. This method sure worked before. Getting 1/4 of the Chinese population hooked on opium smoothed the path to their century of humiliation by the West and Japan. I assume the docile farmers didn't even notice what was going on around them during that era. The histories of these 19th century famines are appalling. Entire villages dead by hunger, bodies everywhere, no rain for 3 years, deaths coming quickly, but death by hunger must seem quite long. The difference between academia and journalism is that journalists have a direct point to make, while academia is claiming to describe a totality in which they use indirect points. But even establishment Fairbanks can't go as low as most journalists and say that the Great Leap's famine was a calculated genocidal policy. He wrote, I quote, "In 1959 to 1960, China was better organized and famine areas full of starved corpses were not seen. But now malnutrition due to thin rations made millions more susceptible to disease. The higher than usual mortality did not become known until the statistics were worked out. Not until 1960 was it finally realized that many peasants were starving." I think that is the end of that quote by Ramin from John Fairbanks. Ramin picks back up. "I will prove later how quickly the Chinese Communist Party reacted humanely after 1960 to change policy. But before any exoneration, there must first be reasonable explanation." The simple, understandable, all too human reasons of the famine. Socialism has to be built. After all, what the heck is an agricultural cooperative where farmers are running things? For the millennia, the system was, this is the tax, you pay now. But once China's gentry was kicked out and the farmers gathered round as equals, this was the question to which they could only scratch their heads, think, and start drawing up diagrams in the dirt. Therefore, of course, the Great Leap Forward was inefficient in some ways. Socialism is something which has to be constructed daily. Still, because socialism has to make itself up as it goes along. It is a social experiment, and society has to experiment on itself. In parentheses, often in an immensely hostile and difficult environment, both domestic and international. That obviously implies, end of parentheses. That obviously implies an increased risk of failure, but only in the short term. It certainly contains the moral exoneration of its actions. The capitalist status quo was certain to be worse in the short, medium, and long terms. China realized in the late 50s that they had to create a new method. The Soviet model could not apply to farmer-dominated China. Indeed, the Great Leap Forward represents the point when the Chinese broke with the USSR because they needed Chinese solutions to Chinese problems, not Russian solutions to Chinese problems. It's terrible how Western propaganda can turn up into down. But the Great Leap Forward was not caused by increased totalitarian oppression of the communists on farmers. It was fueled by not enough central control. I quote here Fairbanks, because not only do you likely think I am not objective, but you mistakenly don't realize that socialism is truly based on giving power to the average worker, not taking it away. Here's Fairbanks again. Quote, for this purpose, there was a general decentralization of economic management in 1957. Many enterprises and even monetary controls were decentralized down to the local level. The Central Statistical Bureau was broken up and localized together with functions of economic planning. This was the context in which the overambitious targets of the Great Leap Forward were formulated in each locality, not by economists, but by cadres inspired by emulation who were contemptuous of experts but intensely loyal to the cause. Of course, the, quote, experts are capitalists to Fairbanks. End of quote from Fairbanks. And that is a Western academic assessment. It is quite the opposite of the journalistic scaremongering of power-grabbing Mao, no? In fact, we see how Mao, as he did time and again, rejected the centralization of power in himself. This very idea is impossible for many individualistic Westerners to grasp, and how socialism is a constant devolution of power from the king to the local person. I continue with that same passage to show you how the Great Leap Forward succeeded in many ways. Of course, the average Chinese person was thrilled and electrified to finally be empowered in their own lives. Yet all we hear about is the famine. Quote from Fairbanks, the result in 1958 was a mighty paroxysm of round-the-clock labor. The face of the country was changed with new roads, factories, cities, dikes, dams, locks, afforestation and cultivation, for which the 650 million Chinese had been mobilized in nationwide efforts of unparalleled intensity and magnitude. End of quote. As any modern analysis of China admits, this is the true bedrock of Chinese economic success post-1980. The Mao-era programs which literally built the infrastructure needed to allow the emergence of the middle class. For the West, as is well known, Chinese economic success starts only after the death of Mao. Yet none of those dams or roads have disappeared and are indispensable to the Chinese economy. These points are well known to those who care, but are obsessively blocked by the West. I will not persevere on these myriad positive economic points of the Mao era, though that would be a fair analytical tactic, thanks to New China Scholarship. You can easily find them. Back to the true causes of the famine. Overzealousness. I love the smell of socialism in the morning. Overzealousness was also seen during the first Soviet collectivizations, and it produced the exact same problems and phenomena I will describe here. Overzealousness is thus a repeated risk which all newly socialist nations should expect and guard against. It is very easily explainable if we simply imagine Mao and the Chinese as humans instead of monsters or docile idiots. At the start of China's revolution, with the foreigners kicked out, revolutionary spirit is higher than high, and the cadres report to their superiors with unassailable intentions. Yes, we will meet our target plans and more! Long live the revolution! The cadres mark in their report, These guys are proven winners after all. I'm marking them down for 100% success rate in indelible ink. The party leaders say, these are great reports. Plus, we are going to give jobs to all the unemployed. So for certain, we are going to exceed expectations. And all that new equipment is going to revolutionize things as well. So I'm going to promise that my region is going to overperform the quota by 10%. And that way I'll bring great honor to my people and my career. Utopia, here we come. And then reality hits. And in the case of China in 1959, bad weather hit and locust plagues. And the books, which are based on the great year of 1958, when total food production doubled nationwide, all thus totally screwed up. Sidebar. Locust populations likely ballooned as a sad and unattended consequence of 1958's 4 pests. Anti-disease and hygiene campaign against rats, mosquitoes, flies, and especially sparrows, which upset the ecological balance and eliminated a predator for locusts. Back to the Ramin's article. And bureaucratic statistical chaos is just as big a problem as the decreased production, because the promised 100% of X to distribute collectively turns out to only be 30% of X. Furthermore, in the pre-computer age, by the time the hard data arrives that the promised X from region A can't head to region B, C, G, and Q, then a reordering prompted by this failure is obviously needed. But the higher-ups can't meet because they are addressing the same crisis in their home regions. But finally, the higher-ups are able to assemble and they discuss who needs what immediately. The capitalists are laughing gleefully that the idea of total equal communist distribution has to be postponed, but the party cares far more than the grain has already started to rot on the rails. What I have just written is a less academic, more humanized form of what Harvard's Fairbanks described. And here is the quote from Fairbanks. By concentrating solely on Chairman Mao as the leader who could fail, we would fail to convey the national mood of fervent self-sacrifice and frenetic activity that characterized the Great Leap Forward. Peasants worked around the clock to break their own work records. Cadres in charge locally kept on reporting totally unrealistic production figures, and Mao's colleagues, such as the economist Chen Yun and Premier Zhou Enlai, found no way to stop the fever. And there's another sidebar. What capitalist ever works that hard, eh? What is the profit motive compared to the encouraging power of the moral political creed? Indeed, there is no comparison. As Jesus said to the devil when tempted with food during his fast, man does not live on bread alone. Back to the article. The above passage by Fairbanks, again by someone who is definitely not sympathetic whatsoever to socialism, shows that the famine was the product of all the Chinese people, of good intentions, of the sad human reality that we live in an imperfect world where bad things happen to good people, that we do not dominate Mother Nature as much as we think. The idea that it was all Mao is pathetic propaganda. And then there's a banner of Chairman Mao, pretty cool looking, like in front of a sunset or a sunrise. And the caption reads, Chairman Mao conclusively absolved by history. All right, Ramin continues. These early problems, history proves over and over, is indeed socialism in its earliest form. China, the Soviets, early communist Cuba's difficulties to radically change from capitalist imperialist one-crop dominance, sugar, to diversified agriculture. In some ways, the West's ordering of Hussein to attack Iran immediately after the revolution was a boon in that it sharply focused organizational energies on one thing, the war effort. Questions of privatizing an economy almost totally state-owned and guided by central planning could only begin after the war, giving the Iranian state a huge head start. For more fortunate socialist-inspired countries like China, however, initial chaos at the first bump on the road is the logical and expected, or should be by now, outcome caused by drastically reordering society from capitalist to socialism. The hardest step is the first one. The mistake is to kneecap yourself by giving up on the revolution when it has only just begun. It should also not be forgotten that China's hand farming method was also extremely difficult to improve on. Laugh out loud. Do you think there's a machine that can do as careful a job as a bent-over person scrutinizing every square centimeter for weeds? Nobody can beat that. In the U.S., the problem was simply putting vast tracts of land to use, thus improving yields from nothing to something. But not in China, where labor was not the scarce resource but arable land, as I discussed earlier. There was thus likely a significant overestimation of the ability of modern machines to increase production. But what definitely increased farmer efficiency was the centrally planned and centrally operated major infrastructure projects. Vast irrigation networks, huge road building programs to improve transportation, tunnel building for mass drainage, lake and dam building, new railroads, steel production for all these projects, etc. And this is where the Great Leap Forward central planning undoubtedly succeeded and why productivity did grow. But the ancient backbreaking Chinese model, a family meticulously farming a small plot of land with the maximum amount of care, as inefficient? That's obviously false, and their huge population, despite a small amount of arable land, stands as millennia-old proof. To say Chinese culture is farmer-centric in the economic, social, cultural, and ethical sense is to say that water is wet. The Great Leap Forward will always prove Mao's socialist genius, thus the propaganda effort, of course, by the West. Indeed, the primary theoretical contribution of Mao was to recognize this reality and to create a farmer-centered socialism, breaking away from the industrial worker-dominated socialism of the USSR, Stalinism, and Trotskyism, which, despite the latter's claim of universality, simply did not translate into the Chinese society in which Mao lived. The historic Sino-Soviet split occurred precisely because of the Great Leap Forward's ideological differences with the then current Soviet model, pushed by Khrushchev. Khrushchev was an outspoken critic of the Great Leap Forward, the success of which threatened Soviet ideological dominance. But even more than ideological dominance, Khrushchev was, as Mao correctly saw, a revisionist, revising socialism until it turns back into capitalism, and a right-wing socialist whose mantle would be carried by Gorbachev into socialism's grave and the arms of capitalist depredation, as we all know. There is no doubt Mao was clearly a hugely important thinker and revolutionary, while Khrushchev is remembered as a bureaucrat who denounced Stalin for political gain, severely undermining the Soviets' ability to emulate what worked, revolutionary socialism, and was ultimately fired for incompetence. The Great Leap Forward and its inherent insistence on the need for specific nationalist/locally based solutions was and remains a major dagger in the Trotskyist version of a universal socialist method. Furthermore, Maoism simultaneously defied and yet upheld Stalinism, stripping it of the egotistical pride it bestows upon more advanced factory workers by retaining its right to pursue socialism in one country. This is also why Soviets made a major contribution to the absurd idea that China is not communist, damn it. The intelligent refusal of Chinese communists to follow their Soviet advisors led to the perpetual Russian accusation that Chinese communists were mere radishes, red only on the outside. The Great Leap Forward clearly marked the beginning of the ideological superiority of China over the USSR. Khrushchev's ideology marked the beginning of the Soviets' lack of revolutionary commitment, their failure to adapt their ideology to cultural ideas from other areas of the world from which they could have learned and supported, and their eventual descent into Yeltsin-era chaos. Focusing on famine deaths is tabloid journalism. If it bleeds, it leads, especially if your ideological enemy is bleeding. Western propaganda implies that the Great Leap Forward's famine was somehow a boon to Mao's bloody grab for power. It takes modern English language scholarship to debunk those lies. From Brown. Hey, that's me. It's strange reading about me in the third person, but anyway, here I go. With the challenging Great Leap Forward, 1959 to 1961, Mao lost a huge amount of credibility and his ability to push his platform was weakened. He even had to transfer presidency of China to Liu Shaoqi. This is not evidence of a despotic dictator. End of quote. A major political pause was instituted in order to regroup and chart a new path. The third five-year plan would not start until 1966, 4 years after the ending of the second five-year plan. The Chinese people became aware of the failures, and public disapproval forced political punishments accordingly. It's the people's dictatorship, not the Mao dictatorship. Another viewpoint never taken is, amid bad weather, locusts, overzealousness, and the usual domestic and foreign reactionary sabotage which accompanies any socialist revolution, the death toll could have been 50 million, 100 million, or more. The West never even considers this line of thought, but the Chinese are well aware that the government continued to distribute rations, to coordinate between differently hit and differently producing regions, to provide obviously revolutionary amounts of service to peasants, that education programs went on the entire time, and that these cumulative efforts by the government likely prevented worse results amid the succession of setbacks. And the failure to produce this line makes it impossible for Westerners to understand why, despite the famine and hardship, the Chinese did not abandon the Communist Party and a nation awash in guns overthrow it violently. If there was a protracted hoarding by party leaders or a willful refusal to aid the people, it is absurd to think that a war-hardened, widely armed populace wouldn't have decapitated the party. Of course, maybe you operate from the assumption that the Chinese are docile. Hey, that kind of thinking can take you all the way to Harvard. Ramen's really funny. Indeed, the CCP was put in power by a popular revolution with the mandate to institute great leaps forward, and to hell with the old gods of rain, harvest, locusts, whatever. It is also never admitted that, despite the famine and hardship, the Great Leap Forward and its agricultural revolution empowered the peasants more than ever. This people-centered view, this from-below view of the culture of socialism, was denied by people like Fairbanks for decades, but as a historian he is obliged to at least give the broad strokes, even if he always gets defensive at the end. Here he is quoting Fairbanks. Once they had been called into being and had found their way upwards in society through the collectivization of agriculture, this new stratum of activists in the countryside needed things to do and were ready to go further. The Great Leap Forward was hard to rein in because once activists got started reorganizing the villages, they tended to keep on going. Liberation, in effect, had produced a new class who wanted to keep on liberating. End of quote. The Chinese don't put their liberation in quotes, as their previous status included so many shackles, which may be a minor consideration to non-Chinese, but it shouldn't be. To sum up, replacing what they have told you about Great Leap Forward is a real step towards your own liberation. Why? Because Western views are based on historical nihilism, sensationalism, misinformation, and deliberately misleading information. I hope that this article has not given the impression of any sort of whitewashing of the Great Leap Forward's famine. Obviously, that would be dangerous. I do hope it is clarified that the context, actions, philosophical motivations, and results. I think what he means is I do hope what is clarified is the context, actions, philosophical motivations, and results. I'm sorry, I'm not going to edit Ramin's work. And we all make mistakes, including me. My main hope is that this leads to de-demonization, showing that the famine was not the result of demons but well-intentioned humans in pursuit of a very modest goal, but sadly quite needed. Mao's famines were feasts compared to the West's famines. A perfectly acceptable analytical tactic, yet totally abandoned among Western leftists, is to force the West to admit their own crimes before they can accuse others of wrongdoing. Brown, of course not Fairbanks, makes very apt transnational comparisons of famines. He begins by accepting the opposition's high estimate of deaths during the Great Leap's famine. And here's a quote from my book. So, 30 million is 4.6% of China's total population of 654 million. Ireland lost 25% of its people during the British-legislated Great Potato Famine Genocide, 1845 to 1853. French colonialists in Vietnam, in a terrible drought, caused 2 million to starve to death in 1945, which was 7% of the local population. The United States massacred 7% of the Filipinos starting in 1898, when it colonized that island country. I could keep on going all day long about massacres and genocide in Palestine, India, Asia, Africa, the Americas, Oceania, and Europe during the last 500 years of Euro-American colonialism, with whopping percentages of the local population decimated every time. The point is, in historical perspective, yes, 4.6% of the Chinese population lost during the Great Leap Forward period is a tragedy, which Baba Beijing officially accepts, but it is by no means unusual as an event, nor in its magnitude. End of quote. And Ramin picks back up, extremely well said, extremely rarely heard. And this I had never heard about. This is unbelievable. I'd like to add the Great Persian Famine of 1917 to 1919, orchestrated by the British, which killed a minimum of 20% of our population and possibly as high as 50%. 10 million people died, making Iran actually the greatest victim of World War I. I bet you've never heard that view either. I defy you to find any English language literature on the Persian famine, yet you'll have no problem finding English language scholarship on the Great Leap Forward's famine. New works are always being written, published, reviewed in their mainstream media, advertised, etc. Returning to the global famines perpetuated by colonialists who attempted no great leaps for the natives, why is it that we have no Western names or faces associated with these crimes, and yet Western school children are universally taught that Mao is a butcher? Were I to list the names of the persons in charge of Brown's modest list of genocides, I would be listing the names of beloved Western heroes. The answer to this question is apathy, ignorance, racism, hypocrisy, elitism, but absolutely above all, the total lack of the politically modern view which can only be supplied via socialism. All this proves, and as all non-Westerners already eye-rollingly know, it's a great adverb, Despite the fear-mongering over Mao and Islam, it is Western capitalists who are by far the deadliest. Despite the constant trumpeting of socialist misdeeds, it is the capitalists who have the guiltiest war machine. The only difference is that the Western Christian capitalists stay on message and practice their propaganda/auto-critique much better. Brown also bluntly encapsulates, and I understand his possible exasperation, the Chinese people's reaction to the Great Leap Forward's famine. I wrote, "In sum, did people die during the Great Leap Forward? Due to droughts and flooding? Yes. As a result, was there hunger and starvation? Yes. Did the masses blame the CPC, rise up and overthrow it? No." End of quote. And they absolutely could have, because, as I mentioned, this was a post-war, battle-hardened society. Arms were all over. Per Brown, and the quote, "Due to the Korean War, Taiwan, the CIA in Tibet, and Western fomented suicide missions, a village often had 100 to 200 arms on hand until confiscations began in the early 1980s. End of quote. Yet they did not have a popular counter-revolution. So either the Westerners are right and the Chinese are just plain docile, or they collectively decided to keep the Communist Party in power because they did enough things right. I'm sad to say that this is a crucial question for Westerners to pose themselves. Chinese docility and other racist nonsense has clearly formed a major part of their intellectual culture on this matter and many others. Therefore, it must finally be admitted that the Chinese Communist Party remains in power via democratic choice. The problem with Westerners on this point is twofold. Consciously, it is probably not the choice they would democratically make right now, given their capitalist imperialist leanings. Subconsciously, they feel as though Westerners should be making the choices for the Chinese still. The only way to resolve such cognitive and emotional issues is via new scholarship, and thankfully we have books such as Brown to clear away the old debris. Officially, the Chinese Communist Party says Mao was right 70% of the time and wrong 30% of the time. How rarely is this fact, universally known in China, reported in the West? They are clearly more honest than what you have likely read in the West on the Great Leap Forward, which is, the Great Leap Forward was 100% wrong, the famine was proof of its ideological and moral incorrectness, and that it did not even contribute to China's later economic success. This is the view of an extremist, nay, a witting or unwitting propagandist. I concede that mismanagement is a crime and that mistakes were made during the Great Leap Forward, but I am no extremist. I say that the West is 90% wrong in their journalism and 80% wrong in their academia. It is a tough task to bring the West down from their perch of arrogant extremism on this subject. I hope this article has made some small contribution to that humane effort. This is the second article in an 8-part series which compares old versus new Western scholarship on China. Here's the list of articles slated to be published, and I hope you will find them useful in your leftist struggle. Number 1, Old versus New Scholarship on the Continent of China, an 8-part series. That was the first one. Number 2, Daring to Go Beyond Western Propaganda on the Great Leap Forward's Famine. Number 3, When Chinese Trash Saved the World, Western Lies About the Cultural Revolution. Number 4, Mao's Legacy Defended and Famous Swim, Decoded for Clueless Academics. Number 5, The Cultural Revolution's Solving of the Urban-Rural Divide. Number 6, Once China Got Off Drugs, the Ideological Path from Opium to Liberal Strongman Macron, the President of France. Number 7, Prefer the 1% of the Party, or Why China Wins. And number 8, China's Only Danger, a Generation X who thinks they aren't communist. About the author, Ramin Mazaheri, senior correspondent and contributing editor, dispatched from Paris for the Greenville Post. Ramin is also the chief correspondent in Paris for Press TV and has lived in France since 2009. He has been a daily newspaper reporter in the U.S. and has reported from Iran, Cuba, Egypt. I'm sorry, I have this huge studio quality mic, and it's just right in front of my screen if I can't keep. And has reported from Iran, Cuba, Egypt, Tunisia, South Korea, and elsewhere. His work has appeared in various journals, magazines, and websites, as well as on radio and television. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening to my reading of Ramin Mazaheri's Part 2 of his 8-part series on the New China Scholarship. Please share this. I think it's really important. I predict that in the future, Ramin will actually end up changing the discourse on the discussion and presentation and the impressions of China, not only with my book, but with others as well. Thank you very much. Again, my microphone is in the way, and I have to always look around it, since it's about as big as a I don't know it's as big as a big old World War I hand grenade. Anyway, thank you very much. So glad you could join me, and looking forward to reading part numbers 3 through 8 in the weeks ahead. Bye-bye.